So here we are in week 4 of this Characters of Easter series, where we are digging into the lives of people who were a part of or witnessed the greatest moment in history in the death and resurrection of Jesus. And we are continually seeing how the power of God continues to prevail despite the brokenness of people. That's a theme that not only was here in these stories, but continues on in our lives today. And this week we focused on the executioners. Now, who were the executioners? Well, in a very practical sense, they were the Roman soldiers, those who tortured Jesus, those who beat Jesus, who nailed Jesus to the cross, who hung him up, who pierced his side with a spear. That's who the executioners were, the Roman soldiers. But we need to understand some of the context behind that is that Rome was really the force to be reckoned with in that day and time. It was said that they were unbeatable, that there were hardly any places you could go that weren't actually governed or run by Rome, because they had conquered all of it. And what was happening here was that they saw Jesus as a threat to their government, because he was talking about a God that dwelled really over government, a God that wasn't ruling a physical kingdom, but actually dwelled within the hearts of individuals. That's who he was continuing to talk about, which was a threat to anyone in government in Rome, because they identified so much with their power and with their authority that they feared that they were going to lose it. And so we covered 2 different stories within this past week's sermon. First was Jesus and the centurion. And a centurion was really a Roman army general. Now, this general was a soldier of soldiers, right? He had moved himself up through the ranks and controlled about 80 to 100 different soldiers. And the centurion asks Jesus to heal his servant, a servant that he was apparently pretty close to. And Jesus ends up healing this servant because of his faith, and says not only does he have faith, but Jesus recognizes the centurion as having the greatest faith that he has ever seen in all of Israel. Okay, now you have to imagine the Jewish people and the disciples that were all gathered there with them. And the disciples even could be taking offense to this. Like, look, we dropped everything to follow you. Surely that's faith, but this centurion is genuine for one time in his life, and now he's said to have the greatest faith you've ever seen. This doesn't make sense. This centurion has killed people we loved, oppresses us. He forces people into submission, and he has the greatest faith. This doesn't make sense. But what he goes on to say, Jesus does, is that we actually are going to be surprised at who's in heaven someday. Who's going to be sitting around this table communing with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who's going to be in communion with God, and those who are going to be on the outside of heaven where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. We're going to be surprised at that, because really, when the external view of who we think should be in heaven may not actually be right. So is this confusing for us? How do we dive into this? What does this really mean? Well, what this means is that we need to broaden our scope of who God is and understand that our only understanding of it may not be the fullness of what faith looks like and who God is calling us to be. But actually, when we broaden that, we understand a depth of God that we never maybe even knew existed. And we see this since Jesus putting this into action when he's hanging on the cross, and he says about the Roman soldiers who are casting lots for his clothes, "Forgive them, Father, because they don't know what they're doing." So even in his time of experiencing this evil and all of this pain, he is on behalf of these Roman soldiers asking for forgiveness from the Father. And what he shows us is that there is absolutely no one who is unreachable for the gospel. And that's the bottom line, because he's forgiving these soldiers instead of condemning them. And if we're honest, I think you and I can let our emotions and our viewpoints get in the way of showing the love of Jesus to somebody more often than we'd like to admit. Jesus calls us to intentionally love everyone, even those who we disagree with, even those who have a different background than we do, even those who we have been hurt by. And if we compare that to Jesus forgiving and loving those who are hammering him to the cross, to me that pales in comparison. And so a couple different questions I'd love for us to think about and process this week are this. Is one, Who is a person or people that you would consider to be unreachable for the gospel? Though we wouldn't maybe say it like that, who's someone that we distance ourselves from because maybe we don't know how, or we feel that it might be extra difficult to show God's love to them? And then number 2, how can you go about changing your perspective to approach someone more out of love and less out of condemnation?